Charlie Munger drove the same car for decades. Not because he couldn't afford better. By the time he was 50, he was worth tens of millions. He drove modest cars because he didn't care what people thought. And that indifference, more than his intelligence or his investment acumen, was the foundation of his wealth. Most people never get rich because they're spending money they don't have to impress people they don't like with things they don't need. That's not Munger's phrase, it's older than that. But Munger lived it more completely than almost anyone else at his level of wealth. While his peers were buying yachts and private jets and vacation homes they barely used, Munger was compounding capital. The desire for social approval is the invisible tax that keeps most people poor. It doesn't feel like a tax, it feels like normal life. You need the nice car because everyone at work has one. You need the bigger house because your kids' friends' parents have one. You need the expensive vacation because everyone on social media is posting theirs. Each decision feels reasonable in isolation, but together they drain away the capital that could have made you wealthy. Munger identified this pattern early in his career and made a deliberate choice. He would not play the status game. He would not optimize his life for the approval of others. He would live below his means regardless of how much he made, and he would ignore anyone who judged him for it. That decision, made in his 30s, compounded into the freedom to live exactly as he wanted for the next 60 years. This isn't a story about being cheap or depriving yourself. Munger lived comfortably. He traveled, ate well, had a nice home, but he never spent money to signal status. He never bought things to prove his worth to others. He never upgraded his lifestyle just because his income could support it. And the money he didn't spend became the foundation of a fortune that eventually made him a billionaire. The paradox is that by not caring what people thought, Munger ended up impressing the people worth impressing. The people playing status games respected him for opting out. The people focused on substance recognized that his choices reflected genuine confidence rather than insecurity, dressed up as success. This is the story of how Munger learned to stop caring what people think. The cost he paid for that freedom, the strategies he used to maintain it, and why the ability to ignore social pressure is one of the most valuable financial skills you can develop. Because until you stop caring what others think about your money, you'll never have enough of it to build real wealth. To understand why caring about others' opinions destroys wealth, you first have to understand how status spending works. It's not rational, it's psychological, and it operates below the level of conscious decision-making. Human beings are social animals. We evolved in small tribes where social standing determined survival. Being excluded from the group meant death. So we developed powerful instincts to monitor our social position and adjust our behavior to maintain or improve it. Those instincts served us well for hundreds of thousands of years. But in a modern economy, those same instincts become financial poison. We're no longer in tribes of 50 people, we're constantly exposed to images of how other people live. Friends, colleagues, celebrities, strangers on social media. And our tribal brain keeps making the same calculation. Am I keeping up? Am I falling behind? Do I look successful compared to others? This calculation happens automatically. You see a colleague's new car and immediately assess how it compares to yours. You visit a friend's house and evaluate whether yours is nicer. You scroll through vacation photos and feel either satisfied or inadequate depending on how your life compares. None of this is conscious or deliberate. It's instinctive. And that's where the financial damage happens. Because each time you feel like you're falling behind, your brain generates a solution. Spend money to close the gap. Buy the nicer car. Upgrade the house. Book the impressive vacation. Each purchase provides temporary relief from the discomfort of feeling behind, but it also locks you into a cycle that guarantees you'll stay poor. Munger watched this destroy countless intelligent, high-earning people. Doctors making $500,000 a year with nothing saved because they needed to live like other doctors. Lawyers with prestigious jobs and empty retirement accounts because they had to maintain appearances. Executives who looked successful but were one job loss away from financial disaster because their lifestyles consumed everything they earned. The cruelty of status spending is that it's never satisfied. There's always someone with more, always a nicer car, bigger house, better vacation. If you're playing the status game, you can never win. You can only spend more money trying, and the more you spend, the more you need to earn. And the more you need to earn, the less freedom you have. This is what Munger meant when he said that caring what people think is expensive. The direct cost is the money you spend on status purchases, but the indirect cost is far higher. It's the compounding you give up by spending that money instead of investing it. And it's the career and life choices you make because you need higher income to fund your status spending. Someone playing the status game can't retire early. They can't take lower paying but more interesting work. They can't say no to a toxic boss. They can't move to a lower cost of living area. They're trapped by the need to maintain their lifestyle, which means maintaining their income, which means sacrificing freedom for the rest of their working life. Munger saw this trap clearly because he'd watched it claim so many people, and he saw the alternative. If you could break free from caring what others thought, you could build wealth that created actual freedom rather than the appearance of success. But breaking free required confronting some uncomfortable truths about yourself and being willing to pay the social cost of living differently than your peer group. Most people can't do this. They'd rather stay trapped in status spending than face the discomfort of being judged for living below their means. They'd rather look successful than be free. And that choice, made unconsciously day after day, determines that they'll work until they're 65 or 70 with little to show for decades of high income, except a collection of depreciating assets and a lifestyle they can't afford to stop funding. Munger didn't start out immune to status pressure. As a young lawyer in the 1950s, he felt the same pull everyone else did. His colleagues bought nice cars. He bought one too. They lived in good neighborhoods. He did the same. They dressed well, joined the right clubs, sent their kids to the right schools. For the first years of his career, Munger played the game like everyone else. Then something shifted. He was in his early 30s, making good money, living what looked like a successful life. But when he actually calculated his net worth, it was disturbingly low. He'd been earning well for years, but most of the money had disappeared into lifestyle. He had almost nothing saved. He was on a treadmill, working hard, earning well, spending everything, and building no actual wealth. That realization forced an uncomfortable question. Was he working to build financial security, or was he working to look successful? Because those were different goals that led to different decisions. If he wanted to look successful, he should keep doing what he was doing, earning and spending, maintaining appearances. But if he wanted actual financial security and eventual freedom, he needed to change everything. The specific moment of clarity came when he compared himself to two other lawyers. The first had started at the same firm, made similar money, but lived more modestly. This lawyer had substantial savings and investments. The second had started with more advantages, better connections, higher starting salary, but lived lavishly. This lawyer had almost nothing saved, despite higher earnings. Munger realized the second lawyer would never be financially secure despite his income. The lifestyle trap would keep him working indefinitely. Meanwhile, the first lawyer would eventually have the freedom to retire early, take interesting but lower-paying work, or pursue other interests. The difference wasn't income, it was lifestyle choices. This comparison crystallized something for Munger. He'd been unconsciously measuring success by comparing his lifestyle to others, rather than by measuring actual wealth accumulation. He'd been optimizing for appearance rather than reality. And that optimization was guaranteeing he'd stay on the treadmill indefinitely. He made a decision that day that shaped the rest of his financial life. He would stop trying to look successful and start trying to be financially secure. He would live well below his means, regardless of how much he earned. He would ignore what colleagues thought about his car, his house, his vacations. He would optimize for building capital rather than maintaining appearances. This wasn't an easy decision emotionally. Munger knew he'd face judgment. He knew people would wonder why a successful lawyer drove an ordinary car and lived in a modest house. He knew he'd feel the sting of watching peers upgrade their lifestyles, while his stayed the same. He knew there would be social costs, but he also knew that the alternative, staying trapped in status spending, was worse. He'd rather face 5 or 10 years of social judgment, while building wealth, than face 40 years of working without ever achieving financial freedom. He'd rather be quietly wealthy than visibly successful, but actually broke. The interesting thing about this decision was that it required reversing a deeply embedded social instinct. Munger's brain wanted him to care what others thought. That's how brains are wired. Overriding that instinct required conscious effort and constant reinforcement. It wasn't natural. It was uncomfortable, but it was also the key that unlocked everything else in his financial life. Within a few years of making this shift, Munger's savings rate tripled. Money that used to disappear into lifestyle inflation was now compounding in investments. His net worth started growing meaningfully. And the strange thing was that once he stopped caring about the social judgment, it largely disappeared. People stopped commenting on his modest lifestyle, or if they did, he genuinely didn't care. He'd broken free from the need for approval, and that freedom was more valuable than any status purchase could ever be. Munger was honest about the fact that opting out of status games came with real costs. It wasn't free. You gave up things that mattered to many people. The question was whether what you gained was worth what you lost. The first cost was social comfort. When you live below your means while your peer group lives at or above theirs, you don't quite fit. You're at dinners where everyone's talking about their recent exotic vacations and you went camping. You're at events where everyone's driving new luxury cars and you're in a 10-year-old sedan. You're in conversations about country clubs and vacation homes and private schools, and you have none of those things. This creates a subtle but real social distance. You're not quite part of the group anymore. Not excluded exactly, but different. And humans are deeply uncomfortable with being different from their tribe. The instinct is to conform, to blend in, to be normal. Fighting that instinct day after day is psychologically taxing. Munger felt this acutely in the early years. He'd be at professional gatherings where his success was measured by visible markers. What car did you drive? What neighborhood did you live in? Where did your kids go to school? By those measures, he looked less successful than peers who actually made less money. He could see the judgments, hear the subtle comments, sense the confusion about why he wasn't living up to his earning potential. The second cost was family pressure. Munger's choice affected his wife and kids. They lived in a nice but not impressive house, while many of their friends' families lived in mansions. They drove normal cars while their peers had luxury vehicles. They took modest vacations while others traveled extravagantly. Nancy Munger and their children felt this difference, felt the questions from others about why they lived this way. This required difficult family conversations. Munger had to explain his thinking, get buy-in for the strategy, help his family understand that they were building something more valuable than status. Not every family could handle this. Many wives or husbands would have resisted, insisted on living like their peers, created friction that undermined the strategy. Munger was fortunate that Nancy understood and supported the approach, but that support wasn't automatic. It required communication and shared values. The third cost was missed signaling opportunities. In some contexts, visible success does matter. When you're trying to attract clients, partners, or investors, looking successful can create opportunities. Munger gave up some of these opportunities by not playing the signaling game. He probably lost some business because he didn't look as wealthy as competitors. He probably missed some partnerships because others judged him by his modest lifestyle. The fourth cost was the nagging doubt. Even when you've made a rational decision to opt out of status spending, a part of your brain keeps questioning whether you're making a mistake. When you see others enjoying nice things, your brain asks, what if they're right and you're wrong? What if you're being too conservative? What if you die with money in the bank that you should have spent enjoying life? Munger felt this doubt periodically throughout his life. He'd see a peer enjoying something expensive, a yacht, a vacation home, a private jet, and wonder for a moment whether he was missing out. Whether his frugality was wisdom, or just neurotic penny pinching. Whether he'd look back and regret not spending more when he had the chance. These doubts never lasted long because he had a clear framework for evaluating them. Was the expensive purchase providing genuine happiness, or just temporary status relief? Would he still want it if nobody knew he had it? Would it move him toward freedom or further from it? These questions usually revealed that the doubt was about social comparison rather than genuine desire. The fifth cost was explaining himself constantly. People asked why he lived the way he did. Why such a modest car? Why not a nicer house? Why not more luxury? And Munger had to decide whether to explain his philosophy, risking sounding preachy or judgmental, or deflect with jokes and change the subject. Either way, it was exhausting to constantly justify living below your means. But here's what Munger came to understand about these costs. They were temporary and mostly psychological. The social discomfort faded as he stopped caring about the judgment. The family pressure resolved as they saw the strategy working. The missed opportunities were more than offset by the opportunities his growing capital created. The doubt disappeared as his wealth compounded, and the need to explain himself ended once people accepted this was just how he lived. Meanwhile, the benefits compounded year after year. The money he didn't spend on status purchases was earning returns. The freedom from needing to maintain a high income gave him flexibility in career and life choices. The independence from social judgment became a source of genuine confidence rather than the fake confidence that comes from impressing others. The costs were real, but they were worth paying, because on the other side of the discomfort was something rare and valuable: actual freedom. Understanding that you should stop caring what people think is one thing. Actually doing it is something else entirely. Munger developed specific strategies for breaking free from status pressure. These weren't theoretical, they were practices he used consistently for decades. The first strategy was elimination. Munger didn't try to resist status purchases through willpower. He eliminated situations where status pressure was strongest. He stopped going to events where the primary activity was displaying wealth. He avoided social circles where status competition was the main dynamic. He didn't read magazines or follow media that promoted luxury lifestyles. He eliminated the inputs that triggered status anxiety. This seems extreme, but Munger understood that willpower is a limited resource. If you're constantly exposed to status pressure, you'll eventually crack. Better to structure your environment so the pressure isn't there in the first place. If you don't attend the country club events, you don't feel pressure to join the country club. If you don't follow luxury lifestyle content, you don't desire luxury goods. Elimination was more effective than resistance. The second strategy was substitution. Munger replaced status-driven social activities with ones based on substance. Instead of networking events about conspicuous consumption, he joined groups focused on learning and intellectual discussion. Instead of competing over cars and houses, he found people who competed over ideas and understanding. He built a social life where approval came from being interesting and thoughtful, rather than from displaying wealth. This substitution was critical, because humans need social connection. You can't just eliminate all social interaction to avoid status pressure, but you can be selective about which social environments you engage with. Munger chose environments where his values, intellectual curiosity, rational thinking, long-term orientation, were celebrated rather than his spending patterns. The third strategy was pre-commitment. Munger set up financial systems that made status spending difficult. He automated savings and investments, so money disappeared before he could spend it. He imposed artificial constraints on certain categories of spending. He made it procedurally difficult to make impulsive status purchases. The goal was to remove the decision from the moment of temptation and lock it in through systems that didn't require ongoing willpower. The fourth strategy was reframing. When Munger felt status pressure, he consciously reframed what the pressure meant. Instead of thinking, "I should buy a nicer car because colleagues have nicer cars," he'd think, "Those colleagues are choosing to delay retirement by years to drive nicer cars. I'm choosing earlier freedom." The reframe turned what felt like deprivation into a strategic choice he was proud of. This reframing was powerful because it flipped the emotional valence. Status pressure makes you feel bad about not spending. Reframing makes you feel good about the choice not to spend. You're not missing out, you're deliberately pursuing something more valuable. You're not being cheap, you're being strategic. The same behavior, but completely different emotional experience. The fifth strategy was selective transparency. Munger didn't broadcast his wealth-building strategy to everyone. Most people wouldn't understand or would feel judged by his choices, but he was transparent with a small circle of like-minded people who could provide support and accountability. He had regular conversations with Warren Buffett about this exact topic: how to resist status pressure, how to stay focused on building rather than spending, how to handle social judgment. This small support system was crucial. When you're going against social norms, having even one or two people who understand and support your choices makes it psychologically sustainable. Without that support, the isolation of being different can wear you down over time. The sixth strategy was focusing on the end state. Munger constantly reminded himself why he was making these choices. He visualized the freedom he was building toward, the ability to retire early if he wanted, to take interesting but low-paying work, to pursue intellectual interests without financial pressure, to never have to take a job or client he didn't want. That future freedom made present sacrifices feel worthwhile. The seventh strategy was celebrating small wins privately. Munger didn't get external validation for his choices, so he created internal validation. When his savings rate hit a new milestone, he acknowledged it. When his net worth crossed certain thresholds, he took a moment to recognize the progress. These private celebrations maintained motivation without requiring external approval. The eighth strategy was making peace with being misunderstood. Munger accepted that most people would never understand his approach. They'd think he was cheap or weird, or missing out on life, and that was okay. He didn't need everyone to understand. He didn't need to convince others his way was right. He just needed to stay consistent with his own values and let the results speak for themselves over time. These strategies weren't things he did once, they were practices he maintained for decades. Breaking free from status pressure isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily practice of resisting social instincts that push toward conformity and consumption. Munger built habits and systems that made this practice sustainable, even when it was uncomfortable. One of the most interesting things Munger observed about status spending was the paradox at its core. The people who spent the most to look confident were usually the most insecure, and the people who truly didn't care what others thought had no need to signal their worth through purchases. Munger saw this pattern constantly in professional circles. The lawyer who drove the most expensive car was usually the one most worried about being respected. The executive with the biggest house was often the one most anxious about being seen as successful. The colleague with the most luxury goods was frequently the least secure in their actual achievements. This makes sense when you think about it. If you're genuinely confident in your worth, you don't need external validation. You know your value doesn't come from what you own or how you look. But if you're insecure, every status purchase is an attempt to prove something to yourself as much as to others. The spending becomes a form of reassurance that you matter, that you're successful, that you're worthy of respect. The cruel irony is that status spending doesn't actually build confidence. It reinforces insecurity. Every time you buy something to impress others, you're implicitly accepting that your worth depends on external approval. You're teaching yourself that you're not okay as you are, that you need to keep buying and displaying to maintain your value. Munger saw extremely wealthy people trapped in this cycle, billionaires who couldn't stop spending on status goods because their sense of self-worth was tied to being seen as successful. They had more money than they could ever spend on actual life enjoyment, but they kept consuming because the consumption wasn't about enjoyment. It was about proving something. The paradox extends further. The people playing the status game often end up broke despite high incomes. They look successful but have nothing saved. Meanwhile, the people who opt out of the game build real wealth. So the insecure people who are trying to prove they're successful end up actually broke, while the confident people who don't need to prove anything end up actually wealthy. Munger experienced this paradox personally. In his 40s, he was worth millions but still drove an ordinary car and lived in a modest house. Colleagues who made less than him but spent everything lived in mansions and drove luxury cars. To outside observers, the colleagues looked more successful, but Munger had financial security and freedom they'd never have. He was genuinely successful while they were just successfully projecting success. The colleagues' projection was exhausting. They had to maintain the appearance constantly. Any slip, any visible financial problem, any downgrade in lifestyle would puncture the image they'd worked so hard to build. Munger had no image to maintain. If he wanted to take a year off, buy a used car, or move to a smaller house, it wouldn't contradict anything because he'd never claimed to be anything other than himself. This is the liberation that comes from genuine confidence. You're not performing for an audience anymore. You're just living according to your actual values and preferences. And paradoxically, that authenticity is what actually impresses people worth impressing. The people who were playing status games respected Munger's opting out more than they respected each other's participation. Munger also noticed that truly confident wealthy people were often invisible. They didn't advertise their wealth. They didn't need to. Their security came from internal sources, achievements, relationships, knowledge, capability, not from external validation. Warren Buffett, living in the same modest Omaha house for decades, Carl Icahn driving himself to work in an old car. These weren't performances of frugality, they were genuine expressions of not caring about status. The insecure wealthy, by contrast, were highly visible. Private jets, yachts, multiple mansions, cars that cost more than most people's houses. Every purchase was a billboard announcing, "I'm successful." But confident people don't need billboards. Their worth is self-evident to the people whose opinions actually matter. Munger came to view status spending as a reliable signal of insecurity. When someone was aggressively displaying wealth, it usually meant they were trying to convince themselves as much as others. Truly wealthy people didn't need to convince anyone of anything. Their wealth spoke through freedom and options, not through stuff. This understanding helped Munger resist status pressure even when it was intense. When he felt the pull to buy something for status reasons, he'd recognize it as insecurity trying to find relief through consumption. And he'd address the insecurity directly, through achievement, through learning, through relationships, rather than medicating it with purchases that would provide only temporary relief while reinforcing the underlying problem. The final paradox Munger observed was that caring what people think makes you care about the wrong people's opinions. When you're playing status games, you're trying to impress a broad group, colleagues, neighbors, random people who see your car or house. But most of those people don't matter to your actual life. The people who do matter, close friends, family, genuine peers, care about substance, not status, so status spending optimizes for the approval of people who don't matter while potentially alienating the people who do matter. It's a spectacular misallocation of social effort, and it's driven by insecurity that makes you value strangers' surface impressions over deep relationships with people who actually know you. Munger's solution was to flip this completely. He optimized for the respect of people he actually admired. People who'd accomplished genuine things, who thought deeply, who lived according to strong principles. Those people didn't care what car he drove. They cared whether his thinking was sound, whether he kept his word, whether he approached problems rationally. Earning their respect required substance, not spending. Once Munger fully broke free from caring about others' opinions, his entire life transformed. Not because his circumstances changed dramatically. He was still a lawyer, still lived in the same house, still drove modest cars. But his relationship to money and to life shifted fundamentally, and that internal shift created freedom that money alone could never buy. The first transformation was psychological relief. Status anxiety is exhausting. It's a constant background pressure, always comparing, always calculating, always worried about falling behind or being judged. When Munger stopped caring, that pressure disappeared. He could go to work without worrying whether his car was nice enough. He could attend events without anxiety about whether his lifestyle measured up. He could have conversations without mentally calculating how he compared to others. This relief was enormous. It freed up cognitive and emotional energy he'd been wasting on status management and redirected it toward things that actually mattered: building his career, learning, investing, relationships. It's hard to quantify the value of no longer being stressed about social comparison, but Munger believed it was worth more than any amount of status purchases. The second transformation was financial acceleration. The money Munger wasn't spending on status was compounding. But it was more than that. By not needing to maintain a high income to fund status spending, he had flexibility in career choices. He could take on projects that were intellectually interesting but paid less. He could turn down clients he didn't want to work with. He could invest time in learning and thinking rather than maximizing billable hours. This flexibility led to better decisions. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't trapped. He could afford to be patient and selective. And that led to opportunities that wouldn't have been available if he'd been financially stretched by lifestyle obligations. The freedom to say no to bad opportunities was as valuable as the ability to say yes to good ones. The third transformation was relationship quality. When Munger stopped playing status games, his social circle naturally filtered. People who were primarily interested in status comparison drifted away. They had less to talk about with someone who wasn't participating in that competition. But people who valued substance, intellectual exchange, genuine friendship, shared projects, stayed and deepened their relationships. This filtering was actually beneficial. Munger ended up with fewer relationships, but higher quality ones. People who cared about who he was, rather than what he appeared to be. Friendships based on shared values, rather than shared consumption patterns. Professional relationships built on mutual respect rather than performance of success. The reduction in quantity led to an increase in quality that made his life richer. The fourth transformation was authenticity. When you're performing for an audience, you're always aware of the performance. You're managing impressions, controlling what others see, maintaining an image. It's tiring and isolating because nobody sees the real you. They only see the version you're projecting. When Munger stopped performing, he could just be himself. No pretense, no image management, no anxiety about being found out as less successful than he appeared. This authenticity made him more comfortable in his own skin. He wasn't hiding anything or trying to be anything he wasn't. What you saw was what you got, and that transparency actually made him more trustworthy and impressive to people whose opinions he valued. Authenticity is rare in professional circles where everyone's performing. The people who are genuinely themselves stand out. The fifth transformation was creative freedom. Status maintenance requires conformity. You have to do what people in your social tier do, live where they live, buy what they buy, vacation where they vacation. But once Munger stopped caring about status, he could design his life according to his actual preferences rather than social expectations. This meant he could pursue interests that didn't fit the expected profile. He could live in places that made sense for him, rather than for status. He could structure his time around what he found meaningful, rather than what looked impressive. This freedom to be eccentric, to follow genuine interests without worrying about whether they fit his role, led to a more fulfilling and interesting life. The sixth transformation was long-term thinking. Status pressure creates short-term thinking because you're constantly responding to social feedback. Someone buys something, you feel pressure to match them. Someone does something impressive, you feel the need to do something equivalent. You're reactive, letting others set the agenda for your life. When Munger broke free from that, he could think in decades rather than months or years. He could pursue strategies that took years to pay off because he wasn't worried about looking successful next month. He could make sacrifices today that wouldn't pay off for 5 or 10 years. This long-term orientation was crucial to building his fortune because compound returns require time, and you only have time if you're not under pressure for immediate validation. The seventh transformation was the ability to take contrarian positions. Status maintenance requires conformity, doing what others in your reference group are doing. But wealth is often built by doing the opposite of what everyone else is doing. Buying when others are selling. Investing in opportunities others dismiss. Living below your means while others overspend. Munger's freedom from status pressure gave him the psychological space to be contrarian. He could buy assets during market crashes while colleagues were panicking. He could avoid speculative investments that everyone else was chasing. He could maintain discipline during bubbles when everyone else was getting greedy. The inability to be contrarian, driven by fear of being different, costs most people more money than any individual bad investment. The transformation wasn't instant. It took years for Munger to fully internalize the freedom of not caring what people thought. Early on, he still felt twinges of status anxiety, still noticed the judgment, still had moments of doubt. But over time, as the benefits compounded and the costs proved manageable, the transformation became complete. He genuinely stopped caring, and that freedom was the foundation of everything else he built. Munger developed a series of mental tests to determine whether someone had genuinely freed themselves from status pressure, or was just performing a different kind of status game. Because sometimes what looks like freedom from caring is actually a different form of status seeking. The status of being seen as above status seeking. The first test was the invisibility test. If nobody knew about your financial choices, would you still make them? If you drove a modest car but nobody you knew could see it, would you still choose the modest car, or would you upgrade because the only reason you drove it was to signal your frugality to others? True freedom means you make choices for your own reasons, not to signal anything to anyone, including signaling that you don't care about status. Munger applied this test to himself constantly. He lived modestly not because he wanted people to admire his frugality, but because spending money on status goods genuinely didn't interest him. He'd rather have the capital compounding than the car depreciating. Even if he lived alone on an island where nobody would ever see his choices, he'd still choose capital over consumption. That was the proof he'd genuinely broken free rather than just switching to a different performance. The second test was the upgrade test. If your income doubled, would your lifestyle change? If someone who claims to not care about status immediately upgrades everything when they get wealthier, they were just waiting for permission to spend, not genuinely indifferent to status. Munger's lifestyle barely changed as his wealth grew from thousands to millions to billions. He still lived in the same house, drove similar cars, wore similar clothes. The wealth gave him security and freedom, not an excuse to finally display status. The third test was the judgment test. When people judge your choices, how does it affect you emotionally? If you get defensive or upset, or feel the need to explain yourself, you still care what they think. If you genuinely don't care, other people's judgments roll off without emotional impact. Munger reached a point where he could hear criticism of his modest lifestyle and feel nothing, not suppressed anger or hurt, but genuine indifference. That was the marker of true freedom. The fourth test was the consistency test. Do your choices remain consistent across different social contexts? Some people are frugal around friends who value frugality but suddenly status-conscious around wealthier peers. That inconsistency reveals they're adapting to social expectations rather than living according to internal values. Munger was the same regardless of context, modest with both wealthy and middle-class friends, indifferent to luxury, whether meeting with billionaires or regular people. The fifth test was the opportunity cost test. When you see someone with something expensive, do you think I wish I had that, or do you think I'm glad I invested that money instead? The first thought means you're still caught in status comparison and envy. The second means you've genuinely chosen a different path and are happy with it. Munger genuinely preferred having millions in investments to having luxury goods. It wasn't discipline suppressing desire, the desire wasn't there. The sixth test was the explanation test. Do you feel the need to explain or justify your choices? People who are genuinely free don't explain. They just live as they choose. People who are still seeking approval will explain extensively, trying to convince others and themselves that their choices are right. Munger stopped explaining his lifestyle decades before he died. If someone asked why he lived modestly, he might answer briefly, but he never evangelized or tried to convince anyone. He didn't need others to validate his choices. The seventh test was the reversal test. If the social pressure reversed, if modest living became high status and luxury consumption became low status, would your choices change? If you're actually just following whatever your peer group values, you'd switch. If you're genuinely living according to your own values, the social context wouldn't matter. Munger would have lived the same way regardless of whether his peer group celebrated frugality or mocked it. The validation or criticism didn't drive the choices. The eighth test was the death test. If you knew you'd die in 5 years, would you change how you live? Some people who've been saving for the future suddenly realize they don't actually want the lifestyle they've been denying themselves. They were saving out of fear or duty, not because they preferred saving to spending. Munger wouldn't have changed much. He enjoyed his life as it was. The simplicity wasn't sacrifice, it was preference. That's how you know you're truly free. Munger watched many people fail these tests. They claimed to not care about status, but their behavior revealed they were still trapped. They explained their frugality too vigorously. They changed their spending when income increased. They felt defensive about judgments. They were still in the game, just playing a different angle. The status of being above status. True freedom was rarer than people realized. Most people who claimed to not care about others' opinions were actually deeply invested in being seen as people who didn't care. That's still caring, just about different things. Munger's freedom was genuine because it came from internal alignment between values and behavior, not from any audience's approval or disapproval. The irony was that genuinely not caring made you more impressive to people worth impressing. But if you were not caring in order to be impressive, you weren't genuinely free. you were just playing a more sophisticated status game. True freedom meant making choices that felt right to you regardless of how anyone else perceived them, including whether they saw you as admirably indifferent or foolishly cheap or anything else. By the time Munger reached his 70s and 80s, the compound effects of decades of not caring what people thought became visible. He built wealth that provided genuine freedom, not the performance of success, but actual independence. And he could look back on the path he'd taken and see clearly what his choices had bought him. That status spending never could have. The first thing it bought was time. Munger never had to work for money after a certain point. His investments generated more than enough to live on. This meant every hour of work after that was optional, chosen because it was interesting, not because it was necessary. He could spend years studying subjects that fascinated him with no expectation of financial return. He could take on projects purely because they were intellectually stimulating. Time is the ultimate luxury, and Munger had it because he'd chosen capital over consumption decades earlier. Status spenders never got this freedom. Even extremely high earners often remained trapped working into their 70s because they'd built lifestyles that required constant high income. They had the luxury goods but not the luxury of time. They could buy anything except the ability to stop working. Munger had the opposite: modest consumption, but unlimited time sovereignty. He'd made the right trade. The second thing it bought was peace of mind. Munger never worried about money, not because he was rich. Plenty of rich people worry constantly about losing their wealth. He never worried because his needs were so far below his resources. He could survive market crashes, economic downturns, personal financial setbacks, and still be comfortable. That financial buffer created psychological peace that status spenders never experienced, no matter how much they had. Status spenders lived with constant financial anxiety, even at high income levels. They were always stretched, always one setback from crisis, always worried about maintaining their lifestyle. Munger's modest lifestyle meant he had enormous financial margin. That margin translated to sleeping well at night, never feeling financial pressure, never having to make desperate decisions. Peace of mind compounds like interest. The longer you have it, the more valuable it becomes. The third thing it bought was relationship authenticity. By the end of his life, Munger knew that people who were in his life were there because they valued him, not his money. He didn't have hangers-on attracted by visible wealth. He didn't have people pretending friendship to access resources. The relationships he had were genuine, because his modest lifestyle filtered out the parasites and users who are attracted to displays of wealth. Status spenders often struggled with this. The bigger their displays of wealth, the more unclear it became who genuinely cared about them versus who was attracted to what they could provide. Munger's invisibility of wealth meant the filtering happened automatically. People who stuck around when you didn't flash wealth were there for real reasons. That clarity about relationships was invaluable. The fourth thing it bought was intellectual freedom. Munger could pursue any line of thinking without worrying about whether it was financially productive. He could spend months reading about a subject just because it interested him. He could develop unconventional theories without concern for whether they'd be professionally acceptable. He could be wrong publicly without career consequences. This intellectual freedom led to insights he'd never have developed if he'd been trapped in conventional thinking to maintain status. Status spenders couldn't afford intellectual freedom. They had to stay within professional norms to maintain income. They couldn't be too contrarian or unconventional. They couldn't afford to be wrong. Their thinking was constrained by the need to perform competence for an audience. Munger's financial independence meant his thinking was constrained only by reality, not by what people wanted to hear. The fifth thing it bought was legacy. Munger became known for his wisdom, his thinking, his contributions to understanding investment and psychology and human behavior. That legacy was possible because he'd spent decades thinking deeply without financial pressure. Status spenders often left no legacy except consumption. They'd spent their lives impressing people with purchases that depreciated, and when they died, there was nothing lasting. Munger's choice to build rather than display created something that outlasted him. The sixth thing it bought was impact. Munger used his wealth to support causes and institutions he believed in. Because he'd accumulated capital rather than spending it on status goods, he had resources to deploy toward things that mattered. Munger gave away hundreds of millions to education, research, and causes he valued. Status spenders had nothing to give. They'd consumed everything they earned. The ability to have real impact came from choosing capital over consumption decades earlier. The seventh thing it bought was satisfaction. In his final years, Munger expressed genuine contentment with his life choices. He didn't regret the luxury goods he'd never bought. He didn't feel he'd missed out. He looked back and saw that choosing freedom over status had been one of his best decisions. The satisfaction of living according to his own values, of building something real, of having time and peace and authentic relationships that was worth more than any collection of luxury goods. Status spenders often reached old age with regret. They'd worked for decades funding a lifestyle that hadn't actually made them happy. They'd stressed about maintaining appearances while missing what actually mattered. They'd sacrificed time with family, sacrificed health, sacrificed genuine enjoyment for the performance of success, and by the time they realized the performance was empty, it was too late to get back the years spent on it. Munger's legacy was proof that not caring what people think isn't deprivation, it's liberation. The things you can buy by ignoring status are more valuable than anything status spending provides. You can buy time, peace, authenticity, freedom, impact, and satisfaction. These aren't for sale at any store. They're only available to people who opt out of the status game early enough and consistently enough to accumulate the capital and the character that produce real wealth. That was the ultimate paradox of Munger's life. By not trying to look wealthy, he became genuinely wealthy. By not caring what people thought, he earned the respect of people worth respecting. By living modestly, he accumulated the resources to live extraordinarily. The status spenders got it exactly backwards. They spent their lives trying to appear successful while remaining trapped. Munger spent his life not caring about appearance and achieved actual freedom. The question for anyone learning this lesson is, how long will you wait to stop caring what people think? Every year you spend playing the status game is a year of compounding you give up. Every dollar spent on impressing others is a dollar that won't work for you. The sooner you break free, the more you benefit. But most people wait too long, or never break free at all. They stay trapped until retirement, when they finally realize they bought the wrong things. Munger's message was simple: break free now. Stop caring what people think today, not someday. The discomfort of being different is temporary. The freedom it buys compounds forever. And when you're 90 years old looking back, you won't regret the luxury goods you didn't buy. You'll regret it if you let social pressure steal your chance at real wealth. The choice is binary. Play the status game or build actual wealth. You can't do both. The people around you are making their choice. Most are choosing status, a few are choosing wealth. Your choice determines which group you end up in. Choose wisely. Charlie Munger died at 99 years old, having lived exactly as he wanted for the final 60 years of his life. He'd broken free from caring what people thought in his 30s, and that freedom compounded into a life that was extraordinary by any meaningful measure, not by the shallow measures of status, but by the real measures of autonomy, peace, impact, and satisfaction. The path he took is available to anyone. You don't need Munger's intelligence or his investment skills or his professional opportunities. You just need to make one fundamental choice: stop caring what people think about your money. That's it. That's the entire strategy. Stop optimizing your spending for social approval. Stop trying to look successful. Stop keeping up with anyone. Just live according to your actual values and save the difference between what you earn and what you actually need to spend. That sounds simple. It's not easy. Your brain will fight you. Your social instincts will scream that you're falling behind, that you're being judged, that you're missing out. Your peer group will pressure you to keep up. Your family might not understand. You'll feel the discomfort of being different every time you're around people who are spending more than you. But here's what Munger learned over nearly a century: that discomfort is temporary and worth bearing. The discomfort of social judgment fades. The freedom that comes from not caring compounds. You wake up one day and realize you're not anxious about money anymore. You're not stressed about keeping up. You're not performing for an audience. You're just living, and you have more options than most people dream of, because you built capital instead of burning it on status. The alternative is the path most people take. Spend everything you earn trying to look successful. Work until you're old funding a lifestyle that never quite satisfies. Retire with little saved because the money all went to impressing people who didn't actually care. Look back and wonder where all the years went and what you got for them besides a collection of stuff that's now old and worthless. Munger watched thousands of people take that path. He watched smart, capable, high-earning people work into their 70s because they'd never saved. He watched people with every advantage except financial discipline end up broke. He watched the status game destroy more wealth and more lives than any market crash or economic disaster. And he watched a much smaller group opt out. People who decided not to play, who lived modestly regardless of income, who built capital while their peers built appearances, who endured years of social judgment in exchange for decades of freedom. That group ended up wealthy in ways that actually mattered. Wealthy in time, in options, in peace, in relationships, in satisfaction. You're making the choice right now. Every day you spend money to impress people is a day you choose status over freedom. Every month you fail to save because you're keeping up with peer spending is a month you choose appearance over reality. Every year you delay breaking free from social pressure is a year of compounding you lose forever. The good news is you can change the choice today. You don't need to wait. You don't need permission. You don't need anyone to agree with you. You just need to decide that you're done optimizing your life for other people's opinions, that you're going to live according to your actual values, that you're going to build capital instead of burning it, that you're going to choose freedom over status. The bad news is that if you don't change today, you probably won't change. The social pressure doesn't decrease with time. It often increases as peers upgrade their lifestyles and the comparison becomes more stark. The psychological barriers don't get easier to overcome. They get reinforced every time you conform to maintain social acceptance. The earlier you break free, the more you benefit, but every year you wait makes it harder and costs you more in lost compounding. Munger's message to people who wanted to build wealth was always the same. Stop caring what people think, not eventually. Not when you've saved more, not when you've achieved enough that you can afford to. Now, today, make the decision to stop optimizing for social approval and start optimizing for actual wealth. Make the decision to be comfortable being different, being judged, being misunderstood. The rewards for that decision compound over time. The first year is the hardest. You feel every bit of social pressure and judgment. The second year is easier. The fifth year you barely notice it anymore. The 10th year you've built enough capital that you start seeing the concrete benefits of your choice. The 20th year you have freedom that most people never experience. The 40th year you look back and see that the decision to stop caring what people thought was the single most valuable financial decision you ever made. That decision is available to you right now, not after you earn more, not after you save more, not after circumstances change. Right now, today, you can decide to stop caring what people think about your money. You can decide to live below your means regardless of income. You can decide to build capital instead of displaying it. You can decide to be free instead of impressive. Or you can keep doing what you're doing. Keep spending to keep up. Keep working to fund a lifestyle that never quite satisfies. Keep hoping that someday you'll have enough that you can stop worrying about money. But Munger learned that enough never comes if you're playing the status game. There's always someone with more, always a nicer car, bigger house, better vacation. The game has no winning condition, just endless pressure to spend more. Munger opted out. He chose freedom over status. He chose capital over consumption. He chose building over displaying, and it made him wealthy in every way that actually matters. The same choice is available to you. The same path is open, the same rewards await. The only question is whether you have the courage to be different, whether you can tolerate social judgment in exchange for actual freedom, whether you value your own financial security more than others' approval, whether you'll make the hard choice now that makes everything easier later. Munger lived to 99. He had 7 decades to enjoy the freedom that came from not caring what people thought. 7 decades of time sovereignty. 7 decades of peace of mind. 7 decades of authentic relationships. 7 decades of intellectual freedom. 7 decades of impact. 7 decades of satisfaction. You probably don't have 7 decades, but you have the years you have left. And those years can either be spent playing a game you'll never win, or building a freedom you'll never lose. The choice is yours. But it's a choice you make every day with every dollar. Choose wisely. Choose freedom. Choose to stop caring what people think. That's what Munger did. And it was the best decision he ever made.